Hi, and welcome to the first in the series looking at what kind of internal dialogues are understood and experienced during the period of people having dissociative conditions. And these are things like Other Specified Dissociative Disorder or Dissociative Identity Disorder. And we'll get into that a bit later, but first of all, what I wanted to really do was give a bit of an outline over the differences, or comparison as such, between hearing voices and what we consider to be internal dialogues within the framework of dissociation. And this is a really difficult issue, and this is something that is sort of most problematic, certainly in the diagnostic field, because hearing voices really have many sort of associations to them to dissociation, and yet it's a lot more, I suppose, apparent or obvious that people are hearing voices and are more likely to then be given a diagnosis of, say, schizophrenia or psychosis, because these are sort of elemental constructs within the diagnostic criteria of those conditions. But there's also a huge overlap with psychosis type symptoms, or what appear to be psychosis type symptoms, and the symptoms of things like OSDD and DID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down sort of 5 key constructs of hearing voices and some of the associated material around those, and then to kind of work out how we would consider those to be either psychotic in nature or dissociative in nature, and then sort of come to some conclusions about how we actually work this out and define these things. And we're going to come on later in the series to look at a lot more different sort of the experiences and what it's like to have these kind of internal dialogues within the dissociative disorders. And there's a lot of material out there already existing about the sort of the voice hearing experience within sort of psychosis and schizophrenia, for example. Now, I suppose to sort of add in some additional context, hearing voices also is experienced within many other different conditions, such as sort of bipolar, for example, or people with drug and alcohol type issues, or head injuries, or sort of cognitive impairments, things like dementia, or it could be as a result of a recent bereavement, where people often feel that they hear the sort of the voice of the bereaved person, especially if it's a loved one or someone particularly close to them. So we have to sort of like rule out those kind of things. So we're not talking about stuff in the context of things like drugs and head injury. And these are standard things that within the assessment of dissociation, we would rule out as being potential causes of the symptoms that we measure. So we're looking at this, taking all of those sort of things into account. And there's also another one, which is just one last thing, which is trauma, because what is absolutely apparent is that trauma is often at the root of these kind of things happening, these experiences of other voices within a person, whether it's psychosis, schizophrenia, or dissociation. Trauma is often at the heart of many of these conditions. So we can't just look at it and go, oh, you are traumatized, you're not traumatized, therefore this, therefore that. It's a lot harder to really understand than just something simple along those lines. So I'm going to break down the 5 factors of hearing voices, or sort of 5 key factors of hearing voices, and then we'll just sort of see where that takes us in terms of understanding dissociation. The first one of these is the nature of content and form, and this is disembodied voices. So this is about hearing voices that appear to come from nowhere. So a person is kind of wandering through life, and then suddenly a voice interjects or intrudes upon their experience. Now, that can be something that can be incredibly upsetting, or it can be quite interesting depending on whether the content is of sort of positive, negative, or neutral component. And one of the ways that we look at this is trying to make sense of the context of that voice. So let's say we might be thinking more about psychotic if it was felt that that voice that came from nowhere seemed to be emanating from somewhere like a radio or an object or something in the vicinity of the person. Whereas if we're thinking about dissociation, that voice that comes from nowhere is more likely to manifest from the inside and be related to something that the person is doing. So the direction of acquisition of the voice becomes an extremely important variable in trying to make the difference between the two. The second one, this is often a very difficult one for people, is called imperative voices. Now, these are voices that seem to have some sort of command aspect to it. So when we're thinking about psychosis, we're in terms of the auditory hallucinations of this, we think in terms of what's called as command hallucinations. And these are often things that are telling the person what to do, and it often can be quite dangerous to self or to other people and harmful in some way. So it's things like, you need to hurt yourself, you need to do this, you need to do that, things that are not really beneficial to the person. And again, these seem to, as with the first criteria. They often seem to come out of nowhere, and they're commanding the person to do something in a way that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to the well-being of that individual. And they can lead to that person to some extremely self-destructive acts, which are inherently dangerous. Now, thinking about psychosis, that kind of command hallucination is extremely common and leads people to do really unhappy things for them and for the people around them in their lives. Within the context of dissociation, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because the key construct for dissociation is to try and ultimately work towards the survival of the individual and of the system. So the type of, command hallucinations, while people do get sort of like conversations or stuff telling them to do things which may not be particularly helpful, they tend to be less self-destructive, but not always. So it's very difficult to tell what's a command hallucination in psychosis or schizophrenia and what is a command about doing something or changing behavior in a dissociative way. Very difficult to tell. The third one, which is conversational voices, is even harder, because this is where a person can hear lots and lots of different things, lots of different voices, maybe talking to each other, maybe talking to the self, and can respond and can interact. Now, this is present for both psychosis in terms of the auditory hallucination type field, and within the dissociative disorders. And actually within the dissociative disorders with OSDD and DID, this kind of conversational internal dialogue is extremely common and something that we would definitely look for when we're actually looking to diagnose those kind of conditions. So the ability of the mind to construct dialogue to and fro with responses that are not known to the person sending. So I might send a message out, I get a reply that I wouldn't be able to predict or expect, and then I'm talking as if I'm talking to a separate person. Now, sometimes the only difference between the psychosis and the dissociative stuff is the sense of separateness. So within psychosis, it could be that it feels like it's being heard from the outside. So the conversation is as if talking to somebody on the outside. And in dissociation, it's more common to experience it as if the person is talking to someone who is separate, but on the inside. And that's kind of a known quality to the experience of that conversation. The fourth one is known as commentary voices, and it's quite an obvious one. It's a sort of a narration about what's taking place. So whatever it is that you might be doing, there is a voice which is commenting on that. And again, it could be commenting critically, negatively, positively, constructively, or just neutral. It's just kind of going through it. So lots of people have this kind of thing running through their head in terms of their thoughts, but this is about actually hearing voices commenting on it. I suppose as if you've got like an earplug, with somebody like just talking and saying what you're doing all the time, and being able to infer difference between the psychotic nature of that and the dissociative nature of that, again, is extremely difficult, because really there's no way of knowing where that voice is coming from. And because it is indicated in the present, it's a commentary on what's happening in the moment. It's not really possible just in any sort of measurable way easily just to differentiate between whether that's psychotic or whether that's a dissociative thing, because it is sort of based in the reality of the moment that that person is in. And then the last one is familiar or unfamiliar voices, which often is, seen to be whether or not the person recognizes the voice being had. So in some respects, and this is especially true for the trauma-based things, a voice is often an echo of a person who was known. So let's say if a person was extremely negative or abusive in that person's life, it may be that they hear a construct of that voice coming back or offering commands that a person then has to follow. So sometimes it can be an echo of past people that are meant, or it can be as if a person is present in the day who is known, very well known to that person, and as if it's talking to them. In some respects, this is less likely than to be the dissociative thing, because we can construct the narrative, the echo of, say, a past abuser or a past supportive person in that person's life, as if an internal part has taken on that voice. But it's much more likely that this is associated with sort of the new build of parts or alters within the dissociative system. So if a person is hearing the voices as if they were another person responding to them, as if they were another person that was known in that person's life and is specifically associated with trauma or with stress, with threat, with danger, those kind of things, we might be more likely to swerve to the sort of psychotic end of the explanation of that. So those are the 5 things that are traditional. There are other ways of being able to look at this stuff, but if we just stick it within those sort of 5 areas and try and distinguish whether or not they're psychotic or whether they're dissociative, what we can understand here is it's going to be extremely difficult to say that with any degree of certainty. And then we add in all the emotional stuff and then the non-verbal type voices or sounds that are being heard. And what it does is it builds a picture of a very, very broad and vivid experience that person might be experiencing. And it's not as simple just to say, yep, that's psychotic because it's that, and yep, it's dissociative because it's that. And a lot of misdiagnosis, I suspect, is done on that basis. And I think it's much more likely that if an individual walks into a mental health sort of assessment and says they hear voices, they're probably more likely to be put on antipsychotics and be labelled as psychotic than be dissociative. And a mistake may be made, a genuine mistake may be made, because the dissociation is simply less well considered within ordinary standard mental health assessment processes. And I think what's really nice then is if we go back to an article by Colin Ross in 2020, what he describes here is the need to really be sort of like multi-diagnostic in our approach, in that it's not just about saying whether something is one on another on the basis of something like voices. We have to really stretch out our understanding of this. And I think the beauty of the diagnostic assessment for dissociation is that it is an extremely broad sort of process. It's highly structured and it contains loads of material. So in a way, what I'd be saying is the voices that are being heard could be symptomatic of one or the other, but in the context of a lot of other psychotic phenomenon going on, i.e. sort of say paranoid, delusional, sort of thought disordered, incoherent thought structures, it's more likely to be in the root of the psychotic. If the other dissociative symptomology is present, of which there are many other different things than just hearing voices, that's a small part of the dissociative assessment, we're more likely to place the person within the dissociative framework. So what I would say is don't make a diagnosis about one or the other on the basis of purely hearing voices. The nature of hearing voices needs to be understood, the experience of it, and a full assessment taking place of the different components of it, but not then to make an on-the-spot decision about diagnosis. I think that would be a mistake, genuine or otherwise, because I think all of the other factors need to be taken into account. What it does is it starts us on a process of understanding the nature of the internal experience, and whether a person is psychotic or dissociative, or there's an overlap of both, I think can't be made at this stage. So there we have it. I think that's a start point for this series, just to sort of like differentiate the terminology, have an understanding that there is this enormous overlap between the two different constructs, and then to simply hold that position and go, let's not make a decision. Let's just use this as an opportunity to ask more questions and look in more depth about the other constructs of the symptom criteria for either of those two types of conditions. So thanks for watching the video. Please leave any comments. As always, it's really wonderful to hear all the comments. Keep providing questions for this series, and we'll keep making videos about the nature of internal dialogues within dissociation and complex trauma. So thanks again, and as always, between now and the next video, please do take great care.